On behalf of Winchester Reads, I'd like to welcome you all here for a wonderful evening. And I'm going to introduce our moderator, Steve Budakian, who is going to take over and run the rest of the program.
First, I want to ask, how many people here are part or Armenian Raise your hand. Okay, then you understand why we're starting late. We're on Armenian time. As Connie said, my name is Steve Budakian, and on behalf of the entire panel, I want to say Pariyagak, which means welcome in Armenian. Now, as Connie said, this panel is being held in conjunction with Winchester Reads on the book Sandcastle Girls. This is not a discussion of the book, and I'm sorry that some of you were disappointed as you came in. You asked me, when's the author coming? That will be on the 16th, and I urge you to come and hear Chris Bojayan speak. I hope some of you have had the opportunity to read the book, and I hope all of you will have the opportunity, because I will tell you that I have read it, and I was deeply moved. And my wife will tell you, I'm not somebody who reads a lot of books. I read magazines and things, and I would really highly recommend it. Our hope, or the hope of Winchester Reads Committee, and the hope of this panel, is that after we finish tonight, you'll all come away with a better understanding of Armenian people, both past and present. I want to thank Connie and the entire committee for inviting me to moderate tonight. I will tell you that I'm really honored to join this group of very distinguished friends and colleagues, because I know they all bring a very deep passion for what they've agreed to share with us, and certainly a passion for Armenians. The format will be very informal. I've asked each of the panelists to speak 10 to 15 minutes, and again, that is Armenian time, so give them a little bit of and after they speak, we welcome comments and questions from anyone, from all of you. So I do want to begin by introducing our panelists. Let me just can everybody see the screen okay? Yeah. To my immediate left is Jim Kalushin. Jim is a very active member of the Armenian community, and most notably, he's president of the Armenian Heritage Foundation, which developed Armenian Heritage Park, which is on the Rose Kennedy Greenway. And if you haven't had a chance to visit it, I urge you to do that. And personally, as an Armenian, and personally as somebody who has lived in the Boston area for so long, I want to thank him for that tremendous undertaking and the great effort that was brought forward. I am going to ask you to hold your applause till the end, but that was certainly well-deserved, Jim. Jim is also an ordained deacon and very involved in the Armenian Church, including being a member of the Supreme Spiritual Council, which is the highest global advisory authority in the Armenian Apostolic Church. Professionally, he's an active entrepreneur, currently COO of RxAnti, am I pronouncing that correctly? RxAnti, which is a provider of science-based information technology solutions that focus on improving quality and lowering the cost of healthcare. Now, putting everything else aside that he does, anybody that can do that in our society deserves our accolades. Welcome, Jim, and thank you for joining us. To his left is a longtime friend of the Budakian family, Bob Myrak. Bob is the son of genocide survivors. He grew up in Winchester and has had a lifelong interest in Armenian issues. In 1983, Harvard University Press published his study entitled Torn Between Two Lands, Armenians in America, 1890 to World War I. He's also the author of, among other articles, the Armenian entry in the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Group. Bob has taught at Boston University and since the late 1970s has worked in his family business. He's an active member of many Armenian cultural and philanthropic organizations, too many to mention. And since 1997, Bob has been president of the Armenian Cultural Foundation of America, which, for those of you who are not aware, is that gorgeous, impressive white building on Mystic Street across from the country club on the Mystic Lakes. I've asked Bob to speak briefly about it as part of his remarks tonight. Thank you for joining us, Bob, and we look forward to your comments. Sitting to Bob's left, I welcome Gary Lind Sunanian. Now, Gary hails from a little west and north of Armenia. In fact, he's an Irish Catholic from South Boston. and as we refer to him, our token Odar. Odar is the Armenian word for stranger or non-Armenian, actually. It's great Armenians would have a name for non-Armenians. Gary has a background in anthropology. He and his wife Susan are authorities on the village dances of Armenia. He has been the curator of the Armenian Library and Museum of America, termed ALMA, in Watertown since 1987. And over the years, under his directorship, they've mounted over 600 exhibitions on Armenian history and art. And again, I would urge you all to take the time to go over to ALMA. It is a real jewel, and of course, kind of in the middle of what I call Little Armenia, which would be Watertown. Tonight, as part of a more general overview, Gary's going to discuss telling the story, sharing the history and heritage, both within the Armenian ethnic community and with the general American public. Welcome, Gary, and I know you'll have some great things to share. Our last speaker this evening will be Gail O'Reilly. Gail, like Gary, obviously has Irish connections with her husband, Vincent O'Reilly. But Gail is Armenian by birth. Her parents, Charlie and Nevar Talanian, were very close friends of my late in-laws. Gail's dad passed away, but she told me that her mother, who I will not disclose her age, but let me see, Gail is 35. Her mother still goes to their Boston office, which is always warmly welcomed as the bearer of homemade Armenian goodies. Gail was responsible, by the way, for bringing these Armenian goodies with her. Gail and her husband, Vin, have been residents of Winchester over 34 years. Richard.
Vin was my first husband. Richard.
Oh, sorry. Richard. I'm done now. No wonder when I called your house, I got like a pause. I'm sorry. All right, well, okay. A little warm in here. Gail was a former teacher. She's been a Winchester Town Meeting member, president of the Winchester League of Women Voters, and membership chair for the Massachusetts League of Women Voters, and development chair for the Armenian Assembly of America. She is founder and owner of a 13-year-old company based in Armenia called Made in Armenia Direct. You can see around us the wares that she has supported. I encourage all of you to take the time to look at what she's brought for us tonight. It's also, as I said, she's the one that provided the delicious pastries. And there are a few left, and please don't rush up there because that means. When I asked Gail, I asked each one of them what they're going to speak about tonight. When I asked Gail what she was going to speak about, she said that her talk is entitled, "What Was I Thinking?" She piqued my interest, and thanks for joining us, Gail. Now, as I said, rather informal, and remember the goal tonight is to have you take away a better understanding of where Armenians come from the broad sense, and what makes Armenians strong, resilient, and if I do say, wickedly good looking. Well, I've said enough. Let's go to the meat of the order, and I'm going to ask Jim to lead off.
Okay, so I'm probably ill-equipped to do what I'm going to do, but I'm going to give you a little brief history, the tweaked version of about 3,000 or 4,000 years of Armenian history to give you a little bit of background, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Armenian Heritage Park on the Rose Kennedy Greenway. So those of you who don't know where Armenia is, you can see up here, Armenia, some people refer to it as the Caucasus, Some people refer to it as the Near East. It is east of Turkey, north of Iran, west of Azerbaijan, and south of Georgia. You can go to the next picture. It's a little bit enlarged. You can see. So it is a landlocked country. It is at the crossroads of eastern and of the west and the east, which has borne a large part of the Armenian history through the centuries. It was in the middle of the spice and the merchant trade through the centuries. It was also in the middle of a lot of Islamic countries, so there have been a lot of wars. Armenia was the first Christian nation, so there was always a lot of conflict among some of the Islamic folks that were moving from the east into the west. Armenians are very proud of their culture and their history, but as this quote said in the history of the Armenian people, any discussion of Armenian history needs to begin with its Christian Orthodox faith, as the two are indelibly linked. There has not been an Armenia until about 22 years ago. There was now a Republic of Armenia, which you saw on the map, but for centuries there was no independent Armenia. And the church, the Orthodox Church, which is the predominant faith of the Armenian people, served as the galvanizing organization for the diaspora. Armenians were scattered throughout the world, and the church served as the cultural and religious center of the community. Armenians adopted Christianity in 301 AD. They were the first nation to adopt Christianity as the national religion. The king of Armenia then was King Durtad, and he was converted by Thaddeus and Bartholomew, who came to Armenia, two disciples. They came to Armenia and converted the king and the kingdom to Christianity. As I mentioned, Armenia is at the crossroads of the east and west. There have been centuries of foreign rule. The Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Soviet Union. And as I mentioned, the church has been the unifying and maintaining organization throughout the diaspora. Today, there are some plus or minus 3 million Armenians in the Republic of Armenia. The Republic was the first of the Soviet satellites to declare its independence when the Soviet Union fell. There are some 9 million Armenians in the diaspora being outside of Armenia. So you can see that because there was no independent nation for many centuries, most of the Armenians scattered throughout the world. The historic homeland of Armenia centers in what is now eastern Turkey. So we refer to that as the historic Armenia. And Mount Ararat, which is referenced in the Bible as where Noah's Ark landed, is at the center of historic Armenia. The Armenians in America have been here since Jamestown. The first recorded Armenian was Martin the Armenian, who was one of the colonists of Jamestown. There was a major influx of Armenians through the centuries, but the first major one was in the late 1800s. The American missionaries that were in the Near East preaching Christianity brought a lot of the Armenians to the United States for education and for economic opportunity. At that time, they were part of the Ottoman Empire. Worcester, Watertown, New York, Detroit, Fresno, these were the major central points of the Armenian community here in America. And not surprisingly, it was where the economic opportunity jobs existed. So in Lowell and Worcester were a lot of the mills and factories that Armenians came to. In Watertown was the Hood Rubber Company. A lot of Armenians worked there when they first emigrated here. And the first Armenian church in America was established in Worcester in 1891. There were subsequently two major waves of additional Armenians emigrating to the United States in the 1900s. The first major one, and the largest, was in 1915 after the Armenian Genocide. There were some, and I'll get into more of that in a bit. And then in the 1970s, when the Armenians were under Soviet domination, there were a lot that came as refugees who tried to escape the Soviet Union, and they came in the 1970s. And then a smaller group came after Iran fell, the Shah fell in Iran. There were a lot of Armenians in the Middle East, and during the Civil War in Iran, and then between the war in Iran and Iraq, a lot of Armenians left the Middle East and came to the United States. Massachusetts has a very prominent history with the Armenian American community. Arshil Gorky is one of the world-renowned modern artists. He was a survivor of the genocide, came to Massachusetts, and he's now is developing a renewed following among modern artists. Moses Golesian. I don't know if anybody knows who Moses Golesian is. He was a survivor of the genocide. He lived in Massachusetts. If you go to the old State House in Boston, you see the gold unicorns. They were founded in his foundry. He built a foundry here in Massachusetts, and those unicorns were gifted to the state of Massachusetts and sit on the top of the State House, of the old State House. And he, in fact, was the sponsor of a fundraising effort that saved Old Ironsides. Old Ironsides was scheduled to be scrapped for wood, and he thought it was a treasure of the U.S., and he led a fundraising effort to save and preserve the Old Ironsides that we cherish today in Charlestown. Yusuf Karsh is a very world-famous photographer. He and his wife came to the United States and lived in the Boston area. If you remember, there's some very famous photo of Winston Churchill with a cigar. That was by Yusuf Karsh. He was called the photographer of the celebrities, he was referred to. Vadastad Kazanjian came to Massachusetts. Vadastad Kazanjian was the pioneer of plastic surgery after World War I. So today we know cosmetic surgery, but after World War I, many veterans had reconstructive surgery, and Vadastad Kazanjian here in Boston in the great medical facilities we had was a pioneer of plastic and reconstructive surgery. He's known for that. Stepan Zildjian. How many of you have heard of Zildjian Cymbals? Here in Massachusetts. He founded that company, a survivor of the Armenian genocide. Stephen Mugar. How many know who Stephen Mugar is? Star Market. And if you go to Boston University, there's a Mugar Library. Again, a major benefactor to a lot of philanthropic efforts here in Massachusetts. So these are some of the famous Armenian Americans that are either direct descendants of survivors or survivors themselves who made Massachusetts their home. Next, please. So I mentioned historic Armenia. You can see here Turkey in the center. Armenia is the right, today the Republic of Armenia is the red, you can see in red. But historic Armenia is the red line that encompasses a good part of what is now eastern Turkey. So that's where many of my grandparents came. They lived in that part that was referenced historic Armenia. They were survivors of the genocide. They came to the United States, as I know Gail's parents. In fact, they lived in the same village in Armenia, my grandparents and Gail's grandparents. Cilicia is where the last Armenian kingdom existed. And there is, that is now, there's still a significant Armenian community in that area, particularly the part that's in Syria. Next. So Armenians always remember the genocide. Some of you may be aware of it, many of you may not. Armenians, as I mentioned, were in the Ottoman Empire in the 1800s. They were under Ottoman rule. They were a very prominent community. There were a lot of well-educated people. There were a lot of business people. There were many people in politics. They're very well established in the Ottoman Empire. At the end of the Treaty of San Stefano in Berlin, this was predated World War I, there was an effort to protect the ethnic minorities in the Ottoman Empire. And so the Armenians felt very comfortable, as did the Greeks that were in the Ottoman Empire. Many of the Assyrians and other minorities, they felt that this treaty would protect them in the Ottoman Empire. But then troubles began, and there was a series of massacres in the late 1890s, and there were over 350,000 Armenians that were systematically slaughtered because of their religious and ethnic background. And then in 1915 to 1923, at that point in time, there were roughly 2.5 million Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire. And over 1.5 million of them were systematically rounded up and slaughtered. And many of them were marched out into the Syrian desert and were killed. This took place at the same time that World War I was going on. So there was not a lot of world attention on what was happening in the Ottoman Empire or in Turkey. There was more focus on World War I. It was the precursor to the Holocaust, which took place during World War II. And many Armenians know this quote, but Adolf Hitler, when he was planning the annihilation of the Jews in Germany, said, "Who today remembers the Armenians?" And he used the example of the Armenians being killed during the genocide of 1915 as the precursor, as a model that he undertook to exterminate the Jews. So the survivors and orphans of that genocide that lived came to the United States, and we are all direct descendants of them. Many went to Europe. There's a large Armenian community in France in particular, in Russia, and then throughout the Middle East, Lebanon, Syria. And most, as I said, most Armenians in Massachusetts were direct descendants of the survivors of the genocide. This is a map of the Ottoman Empire, and these red dots signify where the Armenians were gathered up. So the word went out from the government in Istanbul, which is the capital. At the time it was still called Constantinople. And each of these dots is where the Armenians, the 2.5 million Armenians concentrated where their communities were. And these red dots signify the deportation control centers. The men were gathered up and taken away, and then the women and children were taken to these centers, and they were marched out to the south. You can see the black dot at the bottom of the map. It's called Deir Zor. That is in the middle of the Syrian desert. And many of these people were taken on death marches with no food, no clothing, no protection. And that's where most of them died. And in fact, there is a monument there at Deir Zor, and there are millions of fragments of bones of the people that died in that desert at that monument. So it's a very tragic part of Armenian history. But those people that survived came to the United States. The United States was very good to the Armenians. And as I get to the next subject, I want to talk about the Armenian Heritage Foundation. The Armenian Heritage Foundation is a not-for-profit, a 501c3, as Steve mentioned, that developed the Armenian Heritage Park on the Rose Kennedy Greenway. The Armenians were given a lot of opportunity here in Massachusetts to start businesses, to begin new lives, to get their children, their grandchildren educated. And the Armenian Heritage Foundation is a not-for-profit that is comprised of some 28 organizations, Armenian religious, church parishes, cultural, educational, and philanthropic organizations that all gather together to donate this park to the city of Boston and to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as a way of saying thank you for the opportunity that was given to our ancestors who came and survived the genocide. So the foundation designed, developed, and maintains this park. It's the only privately developed and privately maintained park on the entire Greenway. No taxpayer dollars. You can all enjoy it for free. In the park, we remember the Armenian genocide. There is a plaque, and you'll see it in a minute, on one of the sculptures. But we wanted to not be remembered as victims of a genocide. We all wanted to also celebrate our culture and our heritage and that we survived the genocide. So there's also elements in the park that celebrate Armenian history and more broadly celebrate all the immigrant communities that came to Massachusetts. And in the simplest way, it's a park that everybody can enjoy. And you'll see when I show pictures of it. Have any of you been there? Okay, hopefully more of you will have a chance to go. You remember on the left, this is a picture of the expressway, the ugly highway. And on the right, you can see the Greenway starting to be developed. Next. You can see here, that was highway. I remember when I was growing up, it was just this ugly eyesore. You would be in a building and you couldn't see the harbor. And there was this beautiful harbor, waterfront, but you couldn't see it because the highway was in the way. Now it's about 6.2 miles of beautiful parkland. Parcel 13, you can see right there, is where Armenian Heritage Park has been developed. Christopher Columbus Park, which is right by the Marriott Long Wharf, right at the waterfront. And to the north of that is the North End. And then Quincy Market, you can see here on the left. So Armenian Heritage Park is centrally located on the Greenway. This is a depiction of the park as it's been constructed. It has a few elements, and we'll get a little closer look. The first is a labyrinth. It's a granite trace on a green lawn, and it symbolizes the journey of life. And many people, there's actually a labyrinth society in Massachusetts that goes down there twice a week and walks the labyrinth. It's a meditational device. We wanted to build a park that would engage children and families. As we said, we didn't want to just remember the genocide. We wanted to celebrate life and vitality. And this was a way to engage children. On the right, we'll have a closer look. You can see it's actually an abstract sculpture. This sculpture has 26 different configurations. So it's in its second year, and it's had each year in April, we reconfigure the sculpture. So if you go next year, the sculpture will look different than it did last year and will next year. So rather than just having an abstract piece of art that looks the same every time you go, every year when you go, it's going to look differently. And it comes apart into two pieces, and it symbolizes the immigrant communities that came to the United States, whether it was Irish, Italian, Armenian, Jewish, Lithuanian, Vietnamese. They were torn apart from their ancestral home, and they came to Massachusetts and rebuilt a new community, a new life. And this sculpture, if you go to the next one, here's a picture of the park at night. The sculpture is in the, wrong way. Up in the right-hand corner, you can see the sculpture. And then there's a fountain in the middle. And so the sculpture on the right is dedicated to the victims of the genocide, not just the Armenian genocide, but all the genocides that have followed. And the water washes down the reflecting pool. It comes through into the middle of the labyrinth and is a single jet of water, which is a fountain, which symbolizes hope and rebirth. So it's remembering the victims of all of the tragedies that have occurred in life, in history, and then hope and rebirth talks about the renewal of life and the journey of life that we have. But if you just look at it, it's a park, and kids go in and they play, they have fun. There's a piece of artwork and sculpture, so if you don't want to engage, you don't have to. If you want to learn more, we have little QR codes that are going into the park that'll give you a little bit of background on the Armenians and some of the people I mentioned that are prominent Armenian Americans that came to Massachusetts. So this gift that the community gave, the value was $6.5 million. It cost about $4.5 million, a little more than that, to design and construct and to engineer the sculpture. And then we have a little more than $1.5 million endowment to maintain the park in perpetuity. So not only do we give a gift, but we've given an endowment to maintain it. I've mentioned all of this. Next. One more. So here you can see the labyrinth and the fountain. Again, Quincy Market. Here's a picture closer up of the sculpture. You can see some writing on the right-hand side. The next picture, again, you can see some people engaging with the sculpture. You can see the inscription. One more. That's my goddaughter, the apple of my eye. And here's I won't get into this in too much detail, but you can see these are the two pieces of the sculpture. And it's called a dodecahedron, which is, each of these has 10 sides. And so there are some 20, as I said, 26 different configurations that these two pieces can be put together in. You go one more. So you can see each year, and you see those little circles on the reflecting pool, those are actually receptacles, so that each year we've engineered how the different configurations will work so they can be fastened into the reflecting pool each year. So this sculpture took a lot of engineering and a lot of cost. You can see different ways it can be put together. One of the other programs that we have that's been part of the endowment that we've given is an annual lecture series on human rights at Faneuil Hall. I don't know if those of you have heard of Clara Barton. Anybody know what Clara Barton was famous for? Right. And she was also one of the leaders of the women's suffragette movement to get the right to vote. One of the first things that Clara Barton did at Faneuil Hall, before all of those things that she's more famous for, was trying to raise money to help the Armenian orphans after the genocide. And so it's very important for us to remember her, but also where she spoke passionately about saving the Armenian orphans. So the lecture series takes place at Faneuil Hall, and it's focused on the issue of human rights, not just Armenian rights, but human rights more broadly. The first year we had Caroline Kennedy speak on human rights. She's the president of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Foundation. In 2011, Paul Rusesabagina, who was made famous by Hotel Rwanda, he spoke about the Rwandan genocide. Last year, an Armenian, the former U.S. ambassador to Israel and Syria, spoke about the the Arab Spring. And this year, in October 24th, we'll have our fourth lecture. It's going to be on human trafficking. It's a fascinating topic, a very depressing topic, but one that people need to better understand. This is an open lecture and free to the public, and you're all invited to attend. So the genocide plaque I mentioned, I will close my comments with this. For centuries, Boston and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts have offered hope and refuge for immigrants who've sought to begin new lives. This park is a gift to the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the city of Boston from the Armenian American community of Massachusetts. The sculpture is offered in honor of the 1.5 million victims of the Armenian genocide of 1915 to 1923, and may it stand in remembrance of all genocides that have followed and celebrate the diversity of the communities that have reformed in the safety of these shores. Thanks very much for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank the Winchester Reeds for this opportunity to discuss, in connection with Chris Orgellian's Sandcastle Girls, the history of our people, the Armenians, and especially the Armenians in America. Since I have only 15 minutes, I'm going to discuss briefly 4 or 5 topics of our history. First, the migration and the establishment of the community, of which Jim spoke briefly. The first Armenians to come to the United States were from the mid-19th century, and they learned about the New World from Protestant evangelicals, who from the early 19th century had come to Turkey to convert Muslim Turks to Christianity. However, as you can imagine, this was eminently dangerous, so they changed their focus to the Armenians. Now, to be sure, the Armenians had been Christians since the 4th century, but their rituals in the ancient language, their use of icons and incense, and the lower level of their education relegated them, in the missionaries' terms, to fallen Christians who needed to be saved. Churches, hospitals, but mostly schools, followed in quite an enterprise, and led Armenians, mostly students, to venture to the New World, and in time, younger male peasants followed. Then, as widespread massacres of the Armenians took place in the 1890s, a mass exodus was underway. By World War I, some 70,000 Armenians had fled Turkish Armenia for political reasons, to escape grinding poverty, to evade the horrors of serving in the Turkish army, and to enjoy the opportunities of a new life. Now, World War I stopped all Atlantic migration, but with the war's end, the exodus began again. But now, instead of male students and workers, the migration, as you can guess from Sandcastle, was of the remnants of the nation, mostly women and children, and that is mostly widows and orphans. And this came to a grinding halt in 1924, as virulent anti-immigrant fever closed America's doors. And this was the end of the first and largest great wave of immigrants. The second wave did not begin for another 40 years. With Lyndon Johnson's presidency in the 60s and an ethnic revival, America felt secure enough to open its doors again. Now, the Armenians came this time not from Turkey, which had been denuded of its Armenian population, but from the Arab countries of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. After World War I, these nations had welcomed the survivors of the genocide. And as America in the 1960s opened its doors, these Middle Eastern nations were experiencing Arab nationalism and civil war, which uprooted their Christian minorities. So these newcomers now came from Beirut, Damascus, Aleppo, Cairo, and Baghdad. This was the second wave. Then there was a final wave, which began towards the end of the century. These newcomers were from Soviet Armenia, and after 1991, independent Armenia. In all, from the middle of the 19th century, many thousands of Armenians had come. Today, the community numbers about 1 million. Aspect 2, settlement and adjustment. With some exceptions, Armenian immigrants of this first period, 1880 to 1924, lacked financial resources, knew no English, and were unfamiliar with the West. And for them, their first jobs were as an urban proletariat in the factories and mills of the East Coast, from Portland, Maine, to Boston, Worcester, Watertown's Hood Rubber, the textile mills of Lawrence and Lowell, the paint factories of Providence, and so forth. Others ventured west to audit plants in Detroit, steel mills in Granite City and East St. Louis. Now, their cheap labor made America the workshop of the world, but they suffered all the abuses of the Industrial Revolution. Low pay, dangerous work, frequent unemployment. In time, however, they moved out of the factories and into small businesses, and they moved up more rapidly than most other immigrant groups. And why? Because many had been literate in the old country and had artisan, that is to say, small business backgrounds in Turkish Armenia. This explains why so many Armenians valued being independent, being their own bosses. This is a very strong strain in the culture of being independent, working for themselves. And because of their high literacy rate, a higher rate than most other immigrant groups coming in the period, education, especially for their children, became all important. This is another strong strain in the culture. Now, I said there were a few exceptions to the urban proletariat. One was a very successful farming colony in Fresno, California. That's the home of our great writer, William Saroyan, because many of these farmers had come to California with cash and business skills, and with hard work and sacrifice, they succeeded. Finally, there were the Oriental rug dealers, many of whose firms, it's important to note, did not start from the ground up, but these were New World outposts from Constantinople, that their parents or grandparents had formed large firms in Constantinople, and these became outposts, and for that reason they experienced rapid success. Now, you'll recall I divided the migration into 3 waves. The second of these, from the Middle East, from the mid-60s, adjusted more rapidly than the first wave. They were schooled in the Middle East. They were merchants and craftsmen in Beirut and Cairo, so they easily caught on. In Boston, to this day, for example, they're well represented in the Jewelers Building on Washington Street, many, many Armenian jewelers there. Bypassing the older industrial cities of the East Coast, many settled in California, making Los Angeles the largest Armenian community in the U.S. By contrast, this last wave that came from Soviet Armenia and independent Armenia struggled to survive. They were victims of generations of a socialist economy where initiative was stifled and corruption was the order of the day. In time, however, these newcomers will also make it. Could you pass me that? Aspect 3, social life and social adjustment. It's interesting that each of these waves of immigrants underwent similar cycles of social adjustment. In the beginning, whether they were from Turkish Armenia, the Middle East, or Soviet Armenia, they clung together in closed communities, almost ghettos, speaking their ancestral languages, following traditional customs, recreating the old world in the new. In this culture, one distinct ritual was the family or extended family, the extended family meal. Let me read a description from my sister's book, Through the Wall of Fire. At the center of the Sunday gathering was food. We've had some of it tonight. But the aunts were accomplished cooks, and what my mother would call, they set what she would call a beautiful table. Traditionally, Sunday dinner meant roast chicken, rice pilaf, green beans or okra, and mixed salad. After dutifully emptying our plates, we all withdrew to the living room, where another ritual unfolded. The men would sit down and light up their nargiles, the water pipes, or self-rolled cigarettes, while the women cleared the tables and prepared the next act, dessert. In this interlude, the controversial topics broached at the dinner table were further developed, and emotions heated up. As everything was in Armenian, I had little idea, writes my sister, of what was said. The only frequent phrases I picked up were the Turks, the massacres, or the old country. The aunts had lived through the trauma in Turkey while their husbands had been in America. There was a large picture on the wall, and this was true in almost every Armenian home. which showed the figure of a woman in what looked like a graveyard amid signs of waste and ruin. It was Mother Armenia mourning her losses. During these Sunday dinners, the aunts, usually dressed in black, as well as my mother, excuse me, would end up in tears. They looked remarkably like the figure of Mother Armenia weeping. I should also like to mention two other social topics: intermarriage and ethnic prejudice. Because of their small numbers, their history of persecution, and the fear, very real and deep-seated fear of eventual cultural assimilation and disappearance, the Armenian immigrants of the first and second waves lecture their offspring on the necessity of marrying within the nation. Indeed, no topic created more turmoil in immigrant households than the prospect of the son or daughter marrying, and you've heard the word, an odar, an outsider. And in the first generations, intermarriage was rare, though in succeeding generations it became almost the norm. Happily, most intermarriages worked out well, although one relative of our family, I remember clearly, cruelly disowned his son for marrying an odar. As for prejudice against the Armenians as foreigners, this was strongest in the early days, from the late 19th century to the 1950s. As a third grader in Winchester, I remember being asked about the color of my skin. Why was it so dark? And why we ate such funny foods. I also recall being embarrassed in front of my Anglo friends when my mother spoke to me in Armenian. This was not as bad as when one Armenian named Bagdasar Bagdigyan in Kansas City filled out an application for a night school class, was told by his teacher, who saw his name, "Oh, give that up and change your name to Smith, Jones, or a name like that, and become Americanized. Give up everything you brought from the old country. You did not bring anything worthwhile anyway." And in Fresno, California, restrictive covenants against Armenians, Asians, and other minorities kept them for decades from homes in better neighborhoods. And such attitudes and acts spread self-doubt among the young. However, by mid-20th century, America adopted more liberal attitudes towards diversity, and soon the Armenians, entering their third generation, began returning to their roots and their history. Topic 4, institutions and aspirations. Institutions reflect a society and its aspirations, so let me say a few words about them. As Jim Kalushkin has already said, as soon as numbers of immigrants made a community, they built their historic churches, the first being in Worcester in 1891. Today they exist from New England to Florida to California. Perhaps 85% of Armenian Americans belong to the Armenian Apostolic Church, also known as the Armenian Orthodox Church, which is one of the Oriental Orthodox churches. In addition, perhaps 10% of the Armenians are communicants of the Protestant evangelical churches, one of which is in Belmont and two in Watertown. And most of these Protestant churches trace their roots to these missionaries who came, as I said, in the 19th century, and who had established a far-flung mission to the Armenians. Finally, about 5% of Armenians are members of the Armenian Catholic Church, one of which is also in Belmont. Now, immigrants and their descendants also established newspapers, reading rooms, military societies, political parties, and a host of cultural, philanthropic institutions. You'll be hearing about the Armenian Library and Museum of Watertown. There is also the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research in Belmont, which has endowed chairs and programs in Armenian history in a dozen American universities. Now, although each institution has its own rationale, they share much in common: a devotion to Armenia and to our community's history, a burning desire to preserve our culture, and an untrammeled quest to have our genocide recognized. The community is now in its fourth generation, and is well integrated through education and an entrepreneurial ethic, which I spoke about earlier. And they're well integrated into the economic and social fabric of the U.S. Still, we are proud of and tenacious of our ancient heritage. Aspect 5, and my final one, the Armenian Cultural Foundation. Let me conclude with a few words about this institution. As you leave Winchester on Route 3, Cambridge Street, headed towards Arlington, the 5th building on the left side, set back some 60 yards from the street, is a large white structure with massive pillars. Since 1962, this has been the home of the Armenian Cultural Foundation, a private library and museum founded in Boston in 1945. My father, John Myrak, and our moderator's grandfather, Koko Budakian, were instrumental in bringing it to Arlington. The foundation contains the largest collection in the United States of Armenian language newspapers, as well as valuable Armenian language Bibles and other works, some dating to the 17th century. In addition to these Armenian works, which is are not very well known, are very impressive holdings of first editions with autographs and letters of some of the world's most seminal writers and thinkers. So we have first editions and autographs and letters and correspondence from Freud and Darwin to Galsworthy, Oscar Wilde, Henry James, Henry Adams, and a score of others. Moreover, the foundation has magnificent furnishings from oriental rugs to Tiffany lamps. In all, the foundation's holdings are very impressive and reflect the cosmopolitan mindset of its creator, Vahan Topalyan, who emigrated from Turkish Armenia to the U.S. in the late 19th century. In addition to its collections, the Armenian Cultural Foundation has played host to a variety of literary, political, and cultural events, in fact some 90 over the past 15 years. On 2 occasions, American ambassadors to Armenia have greeted the community there. Delegations from the homeland, from Armenia, met with community leaders. We have sponsored numerous lectures and concerts and have an ongoing publications program. And on Sunday, October 20th, for example, we are hosting a lecture to which you are all welcome about the Armenian orphan rug, which was woven in Lebanon by Armenian girls who had been orphaned by the genocide, and which was presented in 1925 to President Calvin Coolidge in thanks for the enormous aid that had been given through Near East Relief to the Armenian survivors of the genocide. So we're having a lecture by the author. As a closing note, I hope you will all visit our foundation. Though private, it is open to the public weekdays at no charge from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. Please call in advance for a tour or just come. Our curator, let me also say, our curator, Dr. Araf Azarian, and I published a booklet on the foundation's history and its non-Armenian treasures. And if you would like a complimentary copy, please see me after the program. And it tells a little bit about the history as well as these wonderful first editions and photographs of autographs. And on that note, I conclude my remarks. Thank you very much.
I've been with the Armenian Library Museum of America for the 25 years. Although my official title is curator, I also function as registrar, publicist, exhibit designer, librarian, archivist, groundskeeper, tour guide, janitor. I was there last night with a wet vac at 11 o'clock, and we had an accident in the boiler room. I had to take care of it. But my primary function there is as a storyteller, telling the story of the Armenian people through exhibits, lectures, and programs. When the title earlier they said about moving beyond genocide, the Armenian genocide has basically hijacked the Armenian community for 4 generations. And that not only the trauma of the survivors, but also every academic, or most academics from them, what do they study? Genocide. Everybody studies genocide. So many other areas are not examined or studied because all the intellectual effort is put into the genocide. And so some of the organizations like the Cultural Foundation and ALMA are trying to change that. Elma, located in Watertown Square, is the largest Armenian museum in the U.S. There's also one in Detroit and one in California, in Los Angeles. We're not alone in our quest for history. There's also the Cultural Foundation, NASA, and Project Save Photo Archive, which is in the same building as us. We're all involved in documenting and preserving different aspects of Armenian culture through lectures, programs. Why so many in Boston? Because we're not just Armenians, we're Yankee Armenians. Yankees have that interest in history. They tend to be more intellectual, and the Armenian community, just like everybody else here, since all these institutions developed here in Boston. As the museum with exhibits, although we're easily the most visible to the general public, we're the moment the school buses pull up outside the museum or the senior shuttles dropping off groups to the museum. The museum has over 20,000 artifacts in the collection, including rugs, religious art, ceramics, costumes, metalware, paintings, prints, archaeological objects, maps, books, sound recordings, laces, coins, you name it, we've got it. And things keep coming all the time. We had a nice collection of Hachkar remains, that is gravestones from Armenia in our collection. But somebody recently gave us a collection of gravestone remains from the Armenian cemetery in Dhaka, Bangladesh. The pieces come to us from all over the world. Now, if we just collected them and stored them away in the basement, would be the Armenian Warehouse of America. That's not our job. We're a museum. Our job is to tell the story of the Armenians to the world. But what is the story you tell? From my perspective, the most important issue is keeping the narrative clear. I often use humor and I use a lot of analogies when I'm talking about Armenian history or working with groups. For instance, in the year 451 in Armenian culture, there was the Battle of Vartanants, where the Armenian army got destroyed by the Persian army. This is 1,500 years ago. And this is commemorated every year among Armenians and still shapes the culture today. You tell this to a non-Armenian and they just scratch their heads. This doesn't make any sense at all. But you say, well, a great defeat can be as important as a great victory. Think of the Battle of Masada in Israeli culture. Think of the Alamo. I mean, the Alamo was not a great victory. They were all killed. But it is important in Texas culture. A great defeat can be as important as a great victory. When you put it that way, oh yeah, I understand now. So it's very important to be able to tell this in a way that you can engage your audience and they can understand readily what you're talking about. I deal with subjects, we all deal with subjects that are extremely complicated. It's 3,000 years of history. And I deal with the general public primarily, not academics. The stories that interest people the most are not the details of this inkwell is made out of a certain kind of metal and this is the kind of how you made it in a certain foundry and stuff. What they're interested in is the stories behind it, the personal stories. Who made this strange object? How was it used? Who donated it? What does it mean? There are wonderful stories behind many of these objects, some tragic, some mundane, some ironic, some inspirational, and some plain depressing. The kind of stories behind that are much too complicated to put in the labels. So when you want to get a lot of these stories, you've got to have a tour with one of the staff people. We're happy to share these with you. Another one of our jobs is like on the Antiques Roadshow. People come in all the time bringing in objects. I was cleaning up my grandfather's attic and I found this object. This is in grandma's bottom of her drawer. What am I looking at? And so we look at we explain what it is to them, which can be a lot of fun when we do that kind of thing. Traditionally in Armenia, Armenians, traditionally in most agricultural societies, they have very large extended families. And much of the heritage of the culture was passed down by your generation. The grandparents passing it down to the grandchildren in the family. If you're lucky enough to live in an Armenian community like East Watertown, you can still see this taking place today. You can hear it in stories in the family. You might hear it in the churches and the schools. You might even hear it in the schoolyard, depending on what the story is. But that's an exception nowadays. Most families today are scattered throughout the U.S. or around the world. And so the museum has to function as a surrogate grandparent. People coming in here, and we're the ones that explain the kind of stories, the kind of lore that your generation would have been passing on if you would live close to the people that come here, to our visitors. In Chris Bojalian's novel, and in real life, he visited Alba to learn about Armenians. And he's pretty typical of a lot of American Armenians that are raised away from a large community. They're seeking their roots, and so they come to places like Watertown in order to find out about Watertown or Los Angeles to find out about their heritage. The internet can be useful, but there's so much data there that you're trying to wade through an enormous amount of data trying to figure out what are you looking at. It just inundates you. If you come to a place like a museum, you can ask the questions, and we get a clear answer about your question, which is another useful thing about it. One picture may be worth 1,000 words, but one artifact is worth 100 pictures. You actually see the object in front of you, not a photograph, the real deal. This gives you a sense of immediacy and emotional connection that no photograph can ever replicate. This is a brass inkwell made in 1804 for a scribe. This is a dog collar worn by an Armenian slave. This is a gospel book made in 1207 during the Crusades that was kept in one family for 700 years. These are the kind of things you see at the museum. Sometimes the facts don't quite match the family stories. Things can get exaggerated over the years. I had a family of visitors last summer who came to the museum, and they were glowing, talking about their great uncle who was a general in the French army. A general in the French army? I said, excuse me a minute. I went upstairs to go through my files. Yeah, I found the guy, but he was a sergeant. As the Armenians say, inch by inch, the splinter becomes a log. Things grow in the telling. Over half the visitors to the museum are not Armenian. For many of them, this is their first encounter with Armenian culture. What's an Armenian? I knew an Armenian once. Maybe you met him somewhere. Where was the local Armenian mosque? That drives me crazy. Are the Armenians same as the Greeks? Please recommend a good Armenian restaurant. Why do all the names end in IAN? What were the traditional borders of Armenia? What language do Armenians speak? I love that one too. When did Armenians settle in Watertown? I had one old fellow that was there, and this is an Armenian. He was ranting about, did you know that we Armenians are direct descendants of Noah? I just stopped and said, gee, is it everybody? I mean, you get lots of interesting visitors there. And of course, the most common statement I hear is, genocide? What genocide? It's amazing how many people have never heard of it. We get lots of special interest groups there, people from the Bug Society, actually the meeting here next Friday at the museum, the Coin Society, the Costume Society, the Textile Society, evangelical groups who are interested in Armenian religion. But we also, but the most common group of visitors we get are people studying genocide. We get lots of high school and college classes that are studying genocide. They make field trips to the museum. And we get individuals. Our second floor is a permanent exhibit on the Armenian genocide, which is a combination memorial and educational exhibit. For many non-Armenians, this is the first time they ever heard about the Armenian genocide. They're shocked that they never heard of it. When we had school groups, we used to have elderly survivors would come to the museum to meet the kids, and they could interview the survivors and they would tell them the experiences. The kind of reactions students would have. I remember one time, Reverend Vartan Hartunian from Belmont was talking about the genocide. There was a girl right in the front row, and she was just staring at him, absolutely riveted, crying, listening to his experiences. And behind her was a boy who looked like Homer Simpson, sleeping with his tongue hanging out. And the contrast between these two faces right in front of him, while Reverend Vartan is telling the horrors that he went through, was just ironic. One of the advantages for me for being a non-Armenian is that I don't have the personal pain that many Armenian families carry, and so I can talk about it somewhat objectively. It's pretty hard to do when your own relatives were victims of it. But the genocide is only 7 years out of a 3,000-year history, and that's what we try to emphasize, at the 3,000 years. I hope that you can visit us and learn about extraordinary people. They may be strong and they may be small in numbers, but they leave big footprints. But of course, you know the saying, big noses, big feet.
I would like to thank Winchester Reads Committee for choosing Sandcastle Girls for this year's reading book, and in conjunction with that, extending the opportunity to me to tell you about my last 19 years. I am Gail Talanian O'Reilly. I am 100% Armenian, and my good husband, Richard, calls himself an ABC, an Armenian by choice. I was a kindergarten teacher for almost 20 years before my dad suggested I go into the family real estate business and just bug my brother. So I did. Now I'm founder of a company called Made in Armenia Direct, and hence the reason I've been invited to speak this evening. When I began to think about what I wanted to call my talk this evening, I came up with all sorts of titles, but this one was the most fitting of all. What was I thinking? To this day, I can't answer that question. However, I can tell you I probably was not thinking with my brain, but rather with my heart. After the 1988 huge earthquake in Armenia, the Armenian Assembly of America raised $4 million. They went to the U.S. government and got an additional $3.5 million. And with the $7.5 million, they built a housing manufacturing plant to manufacture prefab houses for the earthquake families. So in 1991, the Armenian Assembly was having a trip to Armenia to celebrate the opening of the housing manufacturing plant. My husband and I joined them. That first trip to Armenia was an emotional roller coaster experience. I had a strange sense when I visited my homeland that first time. I immediately felt an appreciation that my grandparents and my great-grandparents in the early 1900s had migrated to the United States. I was so appreciative to be living in the good old USA with its comforts and opportunities. Yet, I felt for the folks I met there. Now, my husband and I travel a lot, and we've seen many poor situations. But this one was different. It was my country. These were my people. Often on that first trip, I could hear the echoes of my father, who always asked me why I spent so much time volunteering for American organizations, as he called them, and why I didn't try to help my own people. And I never had a good answer for him. But that trip in 1991 changed all that. Communism, which had protected Armenia for almost 80 years, was beginning to fall, and the country would soon be in disarray. When I returned home in 91, I became involved with the organization that took me there that first time, and I soon found myself escorting Armenian Assembly members to the homeland to see what the organization was doing there. As I continued to go back and visit, I became concerned that the opportunities for exiting the country were far easier than the opportunities to make it in the homeland. Communism had fallen, the country and its citizens were in disaster mode, factories were shut down, the life of the inhabitants as they knew it was taken from them, and they didn't have a clue what to do. They were living from day to day in a transition of governments, not understanding the rules of a democratic country, having grown up very comfortably in communism. They knew no other. An entrepreneurial mentality or self-employment was totally foreign to them, and there was no employment. My husband and I have no children, but I have a nephew, and I have cousins, and the cousins have children, and the cousins' children have children, and I selfishly wanted there to always be a thriving homeland. On my trips to Armenia, I would always visit an open-air market called the Vernissage. Possibly because I minored in art in college, I felt more for these people. They were simply sad. They would sit in this open market. Sometimes it would be freezing cold. There were hardly any tourists, yet they would sit all day, chewing on the pumpkin seeds and trying to sell whatever it was that they had made by hand. Life in Armenia was difficult for most, and the artisans in that park were equally as needy. So since that very first visit, I have been trying to help Armenia in various ways, but none quite as costly, exciting, frustrating, needy, or impact-driven as Made in Armenia Direct. I will repeat, what was I thinking in 2000 when Made in Armenia Direct was hatched? So for the last 13 years, MyAd, Made in Armenia Direct, has been working with the people, the craftspeople, to assist in a mindset change while providing them with a way to live with dignity in their homeland and at the same time introducing their quality products to the global market. What was I thinking? MyAd has also spent the last 13 years refusing to pay any bribes, identifying craftspeople, encouraging new artisans, stressing quality control and accountability, finding the right markets in Armenia and in the United States, and developing trust. Trust. I had to prove to them that I, as an outsider, had some credibility. I was there to assist them, and I was there to stay, but that was a big, time-consuming job in the beginning. But now, years down the road, that's much easier. The overall goal for MyAd is to establish a link between Armenia's craftspeople and the world. In addition, I want the craftspeople, designers, and entrepreneurs of Armenia to find some financial security and independence so they can support themselves, their families, and their extended families in Armenia. At the same time, I want the global market to recognize the Armenian craft work is superior. Today in Armenia, we work with 25 independent craftspeople, both men and women. The independent craftspeople set their own prices. MyAd tries very hard not to negotiate with them. It would be defeating the purpose of what I'm trying to do. And they are paid immediately when they deliver their goods to our office. That is a unique practice there. 3 years ago, we set out on a new adventure. We opened our own production center. We negotiated with one of our master pottery makers, as well as a father and son jewelry making team, and a senior woodcarver. We have now started our own production company, where these masters teach their skills and train others. It's heartwarming to see the growth of these young folks. In our production center, we work with 24 full and part-time employees, men and women of all ages. Some are self-taught, learning a new skill, and others are brand new to the trade and just desire training. We also have 6 full-time employees in Yerevan, the capital, for our 3 retail shops. One shop is in the Marriott Hotel, one in the Best Western Congress Hotel, and the third one, which was opened a month ago, is in the Tufenkian Hotel. In Armenia, we also supply other retail shops and museum shops with our exclusive items. It's very common to be unable to get supplies, materials, and tools. We try to find them in the United States and then get it over to them. If they are needed by an independent artisan and they cannot pay for the tools that they need, we've set up a vernissage fund whereby they can borrow money interest-free to purchase the necessary tools or supplies. On an annual basis, we also donate money to the annual tree project to replace the wood used by our artisans to make crafts. In the United States, we sell on our website, we sell to drop shippers who sell on their own websites, we sell on consignment to some organizations, and we sell wholesale to shops. Our wholesale market in the United States has been high-end gift shops, high-end year-round Christmas shops, churches, and museum shops. Since Armenia is the first Christian country in the world, I do believe that religious shops might be one of our next markets that we need to approach. In the United States, we also have shopping days on our website where an organization can choose a shopping day, and 15% of all orders placed that day will go to their selected organization. We've also begun home parties. We fell into that idea, and it's been successful. A host invites his or her friends and colleagues, they party, and they purchase. A percentage of the sales goes to the host or to the organization of the host's choice. We also do custom orders. We have done one for the Christmas Revels concert at Harvard University. We've done specific personalized wedding favors for a few weddings, personalized Christmas ornaments, hand-carved family crest, and replicas of objects from the History Museum of Yerevan for their gift shop. End of commercial. Let me answer a few questions that I'm sure you may be thinking. Transportation. How does Mayad transport their goods from Armenia to the United States and vice versa? The answer, any way it can. The mail system is often not reliable and at times still runs on the bribery mentality, which Mayad will not participate in, and the cost of air cargo is prohibitive. So for the majority of the time, we use people travel for our transportation needs. I do believe that some people avoid telling me that they are going to Armenia for fear that I may give them a suitcase of supplies to take over and a suitcase of crafts to bring back. My brother and another friend working on a hotel project in Armenia took over a scroll saw and a blade saw for one of our woodworkers who desperately needed the equipment and couldn't find it anywhere closer. My brother called me the minute he landed in Armenia, and he told me I owed him big time. He and our friend had spent 2 hours being interrogated at Logan Airport in the customs office because of the blade saw and the scroll saw. And that was before 9/11.
Your clothing was a toothbrush.
This is part of the challenge of doing business in Armenia. Hopefully someday it will be easier. Another question, what don't I have? A lot. At the top of that list is experience. I have no experience in any retail, wholesale business, no experience in identifying the right U.S. market, no experience in pricing, in buying, in marketing strategy, in importing. Remember, I am a retired kindergarten teacher. What was I thinking? Yet, what do I have? A lot. I have folks in the U.S. who recognize quality products and are willing to pay for them. I have tourists in Armenia who want to take home something special. And I also have folks who simply like to support artisans. I do believe I have a lucky star that follows me and Mayad. I have been blessed by some talented, dedicated, hardworking, committed individuals, both paid and volunteers, who have given Mayad a great deal of their time and expertise, both in Armenia and here. Please check out the many angels I have listed on my website. I am so fortunate to have these angels watching over and helping me with this project. On each visit, I see encouraging signs. Some of the artisans have noticeably gained weight. As small as that is, it's a good sign. It means they have enough food on their table. Also, one of the artisans has hired others to do some of the rudimentary work for him so he can generate more crafts per month for Mayad. One other artisan asked me if Mayad could guarantee him a certain number of orders monthly as he was thinking of hiring an assistant. This is an incredible mind change for someone who has grown up under communism. No one ever hired anybody else. Years ago, when I first mentioned to them my dream of their needing to hire others to assist them, they truly thought I was wacky. It was beyond their comprehension, and now they're doing it. These examples are very heartwarming to me. They are grasping entrepreneurial spirit and are providing not only for themselves and their families, but for other families. Remember that open market, the vernissage I mentioned at the beginning of my talk? Well, a few visits ago, I overheard two artisans conversing with each other, and one was bragging that he didn't sell at the vernissage anymore. He didn't need to. Clearly, this has become a status symbol among the artisans. Mayad is giving them enough work, and they don't need to sell in the open market anymore. Also, Mayad seldom goes out seeking artisans any longer. We've developed a reputation, and craftspeople call and come to us with their crafts because they know we can help them. Customers come into our shops in Armenia and comment that they don't see our type of crafts anywhere else. We are special. This is all progress, and I am delighted with it. Folks have asked me, so I need to take this opportunity to also tell you what you can do for this endeavor if you are interested. I'm always looking for personal connections to buyers in the appropriate shops, connections to publicity folks, and for religious shop connections, as I think the first Christian country is a good PR advantage. And finally, please check out the website. And if you think Made in Armenia Direct, it has merit, tell your friends. If you see things that need fixing, tell me. And lastly, on a very selfish note, I believe there are few opportunities in our lifetime to really make a difference. And in Armenia, there are ample opportunities to make that difference. You just need to find the opportunity that's right for you. I'll be honest, there's no guarantee this project is going to succeed, but I need to know that I have tried in a small way to preserve my homeland. I want to answer my question, what was I thinking? The answer is still, I do not know, but I'm not ready to give up. I want to tell you about a happy story and a happy sad story, and then I'll be done. This is my happy sad story. Nargis and her husband and their children, he was unemployed, they had no money, communism fell, he was out of a job. She would cook, she would clean, she would take care of the house, she would take care of the children. He would sit outside with his friends and wait for communism to come back and his job to come back again. He did nothing. She started painting on scarves. I would take her the paint, I would take her the silk, she would roll up the ends and sew, and then she would paint on it, and she did a terrific job. A couple of years later, when I saw her again, she told me she had taught her husband how to hem it. And I thought, that is great. He now at least helps her. It's not below him to help out. And I was thrilled. The sad part of my story is that they've gone to Russia and they're not coming back to Armenia. So I feel badly because I don't want everybody who's talented to go. And he was even getting a different mentality other than communist mentality, but unfortunately, I've lost Nargis. This is Rubik. Rubik was a commercial airplane pilot under communist times. When communism fell, he lost his job. He didn't exactly know what to do, but he had some grandchildren at home, so he would start carving, making things for his grandchildren. And in Armenia, everybody lives in apartment buildings. They don't have their own homes. And somebody one time said to me, there's this guy who makes this wooden stuff. Why don't you go see him? So anyway, we went and we visited him. First of all, to get his wood, he would go when they were remodeling houses or something, and he would take the window sills and the window frames, and that was his wood supply. He had one room in his house just full of wood. But anyway, Rubik carved for his grandchildren. He found a talent that he didn't really know he had, and Rubik carves these kinds of things. Rubik is now our master wood carver, teaching young boys and girls, not young, 18, how to carve and make things from wood. So he's still with us, and he's my master wood carving person. Thank you very much for listening.
I just can't thank you enough for what you did. I learned so much, and I hope that we accomplished our goal of letting you better understand who Armenians are, where we came from, and where we're going. Now, it is kind of late, but I would love to entertain any questions you might have. The question was whether the U.S. government would ever recognize genocide, and if not, why not? If you want to make a brief statement on that?
Just a demographic thing. There are about 1 million Armenians in America. There are 53 million Latinos. So if we were to galvanize all of our people, and the Latinos, and I have nothing against the Latinos, would galvanize only 10% of them, you can see how small we are. The great French premier, Georges Clemenceau, during the First World War, after the First World War, said when the Armenians wanted to have their own independent nation, he said, oh, these Armenians, they're the small change of history, the small change of history. Unfortunately, that's true. Coupled with the fact that the Turks have become great allies of the United States. So I would have to agree with the questioner that at least in my lifetime, I see no prospect of that kind of recognition, which is is recognized by the House of Representatives, recognized by many state legislatures, countries around the world, but for the United States, I don't see it as a possibility, I'm sorry to say.
The question was, who was the architect or sculptor of the sculpture that's in the park?
The gentleman's name, there was actually a committee, but the chair and the spirit behind it was a gentleman by the name of Donald Talalian. He resides in Newton.
Does Alma carry the Made in Armenia direct merchandise? Yes, the answer is yes. The question was, because Kurdistan and Armenia are in close proximity or overlap each other to some extent, how do they get along?
At this point, they get along fairly well, I guess you would say, and we've had many Kurdish visitors to the museum. In fact, we had somebody there Sunday doing research, comparing Armenian and Kurdish folk customs up in the library. Armenia, the Kurdistan, or the Kurdish population, is spread among 5 countries, and the only of the 5 countries that the Kurds were allowed to use their language for radio programs, etc., schools, was in Armenia. So the Armenians have kept decent relations. I mean, the Kurds, generally speaking, are very willing to admit their, I'm sorry about my grandfather, what he did to your country or to your people, but as far as the long-term prospects of the Kurds themselves and politically, that's anybody's guess as far as whether a Kurdish state will emerge anywhere in that region of the world.
I actually have a comment on that in a general sense. Bob mentioned how a lot of Armenians are rug dealers. And I think in a more general sense, a lot of Armenians are merchants. And one of the reasons for that is Armenians are spread throughout the world and have been traditionally, and they've also tended to assimilate very well into many different cultures. So they were able to establish themselves as merchants because they didn't develop instant enemies. I mean, as Christians in Muslim countries, as Christians in the Jewish countries, and even in China and India. I was in India many years ago, and I was in Madras and saw an Armenian church in the middle of Madras. I was absolutely surprised.
We're open Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from 12 to 6. Other times by appointment. Often group tours are often on days we're not open. But you have to make arrangements with the office for that.
We're open Monday through Friday from 9 o'clock till 2 o'clock. And just call in advance, and our curator will be delighted to show you around. Groups up to, he can handle groups up to 25. And there are some pamphlets about this upcoming lecture, and on that, the printout, there's our telephone number as well. Just give him a call, and he knows all about this event and would be delighted to show all of you around.
Before you ask, Armenian Heritage Park is open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day.
Okay, the question was the assimilation of Armenians and kind of with other cultures. And have Armenians been able to maintain their identity through the whole process?
Right. I know there's a strong fear in the Jewish community for
Right.
that type of thing.
I will say yes, but let me pass this on.
So as I said, my grandfather and grandmother were survivors of the genocide. Both my parents died. Both my parents are Armenian. I speak Armenian, both Eastern and Western. I'm very involved in my community. So to me, my identity is very important to me. But I think assimilation is just like any other, ethnic group that's come to the United States. The first generation of Italian Americans, they kept very strong to their roots. They still do today, but less so than when they first came. Irish Americans in a similar fashion. So I think the assimilation has happened in a very similar pattern. But I think one thing that was different, as Dr. Myrak mentioned, when there was no Republic of Armenia, I think it created a stronger sense of mutual identity because there was no Armenia to go to preserve the heritage and the culture. Now that there is, I think people in the diaspora want to help the country, but they're also less, I think, focused on preserving the identity, and I think the assimilation is a little bit more natural now. Personal opinion.
What the colors and the flag signify?
The explanation is red is for the blood of the martyrs, the freedom fighters. Blue is for the sky above, of course. And the orange is, well, two rationales for that. One is actually apricot, for the apricots of Armenia. The actual Latin term for apricot is Prunus armenicus, the Armenian apple. The other rationale is it stands for amber waves of grain, for the fields of Armenia. Depends who you talk to.
I'm buying it. I'm buying it. Okay, any other questions? Just to circle back a little bit about Armenian identity. I married an Armenian, as most of you know. My wife Karen is also Armenian, and I can't say that I've been strongly connected to the Armenian people, except through food, obviously, and we were married in the Armenian church. But I will tell you something, just to kind of circle back to what I kind of want to leave you with, is when I was asked to do this, to moderate this panel, and I knew that it was related to the coming of Chris Bojayan, I read this book. And for those of you who haven't read it, I recommend it because I will tell you, it had probably the most profound effect on me of any book I've ever read. Thank you. I want to thank you.